Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think a few of us are still enjoying some much-deserved chai, but we're running a tiny bit late. So we're going to crack on with the plenary session, and it's on the climate, water, energy, and food nexus. Now, if we know one thing about sustainable development, it's that you cannot tackle it bit by bit. Every time we try to chop it into manageable chunks, it reforms into a single whole, and that whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But if that sounds daunting, we also know there are opportunities there as well. You can take as one example people referred to today, clean cook stoves. They not only save forests, they save lives by cutting indoor air pollution, they save their users money, and they cut carbon. A single cook stove, multiple benefits. So the way these things hold together, climate, water, energy, food, and our understanding of it, absolutely crucial to the way in which we can really do sustainable development. So there is hope in complexity. And to unpick this for us, we've got an excellent panel. I'd like to invite them up to join us. We have, first of all, Ambassador Jonathan Addleton, who's the Mission Director of USAID in India. Come and join us, sir. And Mr. Anindya Chatterjee, who's Regional Director, Asia, of the International Development Research Centre. Then Mr. Klaas Eklund, Senior Economist at Sustainability at the Stockholms and Bank, SEB. Dr. Kiwan Riyahi, who's Director of the Energy Program at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. Mr. Ravi Singh, Secretary General and CEO of WWF India, Worldwide Fund for Nature. And to chair it, Mr. Ajay Shankar, who's Distinguished Fellow here at TERI. Thank you very much.
I'd request our panelists to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes because we are running quite late, and then take a few questions from the audience, and then hopefully each one of the panelists will get a chance to respond. This year has been significant because we've had the Paris Agreement. A few days back, India signed and ratified the Paris Agreement. And I think the topic we have at this session is really crucial and critical for at least the developing world. And the nexus between climate, water, energy, and food is one which needs to be seen holistically, and very, very difficult and major choices would need to be made in the next 5-10 years if we are not to face very serious problems. So on that note, I would like to begin the discussion and request Ambassador Jonathan Addleton to make his opening comments. And I must add that we have an exceptionally distinguished panel. I would not take time in reading their CVs, though I'm sorely tempted to do so. So I'd request you to have a look at their CVs at leisure.
Well, thank you very much. Does the microphone work here? Can people hear me? Yeah, maybe I should. How about this? Is this better? Okay, no, I'll do it through this. Again, trying to stick to the 5 or 6 minutes each. I'll go quickly. I'm lucky because I'm first, so I can kind of help set the stage. And what I'm going to basically do is about half the time, I'm going to rattle off some statistics. And everything in India is big and impressive, and I'm just going to mention a few of those. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what USAID is doing, again, just to kind of set the stage. Again, agriculture obviously being important, the nexus of these, food and water and energy being so important. But agriculture, especially in terms of employment, important for India, employs more than 50% of the population, contributes 17% of the GDP. Food production between 1950 and 2000, fourfold increase, which again I think is impressive. Another figure, 70% of the total water used in India is for agriculture. This actually parallels the global figure as well. In some cases, and perhaps one of the really big ones is that India feeds 17% of the world's population on 3% of the arable land. That's hugely impressive. But in terms of water use, the 70% of the water use in agriculture in India is comparable to the world as a whole. And as far as India is concerned, 61% of the irrigated areas rely on groundwater, which actually is more efficient than rain-fed agriculture. Another interesting thing in terms of the growth, and this issue over sustainability I think comes into play here, is that the groundwater use for irrigation has gone up from around 5 million hectares in 1951 to 35 million, a seven-fold increase, again, during that time when that food production was also increasing. And then, of course, everything is impressive in India in terms of the numbers. You're talking about 18 million irrigation pumps in the country, which are connected to the grid power, and another 7 million pumps that run on diesel. I think what happens, this is talking about Nexus. I think one of the huge challenges going forward is this figure, or this observation, that the growth of one sector, agriculture, is being supported by what seems to be unsustainable trends in the other two sectors, groundwater and electricity. So at some point, there's a collision in terms of those kinds of concerns. A couple other things to say. India is already one of the most water-stressed nations in the world. 50% of India's total land area faces high to extremely high water stress, and also 54% of India's groundwater wells are decreasing. And again, think of that figure about how much they're dependent for irrigated agriculture on groundwater, and that groundwater is in fact decreasing. So all this means that the water resource concerns mean that as climate change takes place, that also puts more pressure on the system. Some of the ideas in terms of sustainability, in terms of possible at least short-term solutions, is more efficient water usage, more efficient pumps, more efficient solar water pumps, rainwater harvesting, climate-resilient agriculture, and sufficient water storage. AID actually, in partnership with India, is working on a number of these areas, and what I'm going to do with the next just very few minutes is to talk very briefly about some of those ways in which we offer support. When I found out I was going to be in this panel a few days ago and that the subject was water, energy, food nexus, my colleagues passed this on to me. This is one of our projects. It's called the Water Energy Nexus Project. So I thought, well, that's pretty appropriate, and I guess if nothing else, AID has identified a concern that's very real. And I'm going to just give a very potted, very quick view about a couple highlights of these projects. This particular one is a public-private civil society partnership to replace energy-inefficient water pumps with energy-efficient ones at no cost to the farmer. What happens under this scheme is that there's an agreement between an energy services company, INZEN, and BESCOM, the utility, under which both partners share a certain proportion of the benefits of energy savings. And for every unit of energy saved above the baseline consumption from 2009, BESCOM receives almost 12% of the benefits of energy savings, and the rest goes to INZEN. Under this sort of pilot scheme, if you will, there was a 35% energy savings that was reported in 2012. And I mention this because I think across the system, there's huge room for savings. And when you talk about sustainability, some of that inefficiency will definitely come into play. A second project, just sort of reach for the auto visuals here. This is actually, it's with the Centers for International Project Trust. And there's many things that happen here, but one of these things is the introduction of new technology, in this case, water efficiency technology. And there's something called a tensiometer. It's a very simple device, but it's used to measure soil moisture or water potential. And it's pretty critical because then you can not oversupply with water. Again, on a sort of a pilot basis, there's been a distribution of more than 13,000 of these tensiometers in some 375 villages in Punjab and Gujarat. And in this case, again, these things are just illustrating the fact that savings are to be had. In this case, there's a 15 to 20% savings that can be achieved in the water area. Again, moving very quickly to a couple other examples. Probably in the energy sector, the flagship program, and this is very, like everything we do, frankly, is very much in partnership with India, but it's something called PACE, the PACE project, PACE-D, recently issued in August 2016 when Secretary of State Kerry came here. This is doing a ton of stuff in energy, well, especially in renewable energy, and solar energy and wind energy. And I think the things that are especially relevant to this nexus, if you will, between energy and water and food is solar pumps. I talked about all the pumps. This may seem minor in terms of all those millions of pumps in India, but 130 solar pumps deployed in this case in Karnataka, and trying to test that. And there's others program in Bihar as well. And again, trying to test the notion of solar pumps, and actually in some cases solar irrigation as well. A lot of interesting things there, but I'll just mention those couple things. Another one, and I think of the theme of this too, is understanding India's water energy nexus. And so if nothing else, if this is the theme of this table, of this panel, I'll say that our program documents repeatedly refer to this Nexus thing that we're talking about. And here, this is kind of interesting because TERI is one of the hosts here. This actually does involve TERI along with a couple other Indian think tanks, the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, and the Integrated Research and Action for Development, IRAD. This one is actually about modeling, and it's about modeling of the Nexus that we're talking about. So in terms of resources being here, again, just to note that there's modeling going on in this area. The last thing I'll mention, we got a number of projects in the agricultural space. This one is from SkyMet. I don't know if people are familiar with SkyMet, but when you talk about resiliency, when you talk about responding to climate change, this one's pretty important because it gives farmers direct access to weather and the trends and the changes, very immediate and also very short term, what to look like in the next week and then some prognosis further on. So this too, again, it's a combination which is so important to us of technology and of partnerships and making a difference in this case in the sustainable nexus between energy, water, and food. I'll leave it at that and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, and I think when we were waiting for the session, you had inquired as to when you were speaking, and I think the panelists, those who designed it, chose well in asking you to be the first speaker. Because what has come out in your comments is that there are pilots and there are technologies which offer great hope. And I think I am an optimist, and in all this sustainability debate, I've always felt that human ingenuity and innovation would allow us to overcome this, what appear to be possible challenges. So this is very heartening and encouraging, whatever we've heard. May I request Mr. Anand Chatterjee, Regional Director, Asia International Development Research Center, for his comments. I'll give you the mic, I think.
I think the mic will be better. Thank you, Chair, and
yeah, just keep it.
And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me try to do two things now. Firstly, to unpack the issue of the Nexus, let us look at some sectoral programming and how it may offset risks and vulnerability in the other sectors. And I'll give you some practical examples from work that we do with partners in India and in the region. So in parts of China, for example, excessive use of pesticides in food production has a huge impact on health, costing over an estimated $1 billion a year, and has adversely affected farm and biodiversity. We support our research project in Southeast Asia and China that looks at intensification of livestock and food production and its impact on health and its impact on environment. In India, the need for increasing food production and increasingly erratic rainfall system has had a serious impact on groundwater table. Similarly, in Hindu Kush region, mountainous region, there is a subsidy, for example, in Pakistan for extracting groundwater, and Balochistan, which is an arid region, is now producing apples with extracting groundwater and using groundwater irrigation, which requires huge amounts of energy in a country facing crippling energy crisis. Eucalyptus trees, once promoted by development banks and governments as part of the agroforestry project, are now contributing to groundwater depletion, for example, in Akravati sub-basin in Karnataka and Noyal sub-basin in Tamil Nadu state. So these are some of the examples, that negative lessons are sometimes very important, and therefore, to provide the context of the discussion of today's panel, I wanted to bring them up so that we can have a more granular discussion on why we need to move towards a much more integrated and a sustainable approach to agriculture, water, food, water, electricity, energy, and so forth. Now, as Ambassador has said that there are a number of interesting things are happening, and again, let me give you a few practical examples that we are part of, and that I have seen partners working with. There is interesting work happening on bringing back varieties of small millets, which are drought resistant. It's a traditional staple and nutritious. Patents are pending with a couple of agricultural universities for an innovative technique that uses nanotechnology to use hexanol, which is a naturally occurring substance that will keep fresh fruit longer. There's a public-private partnership with Government of Uttar Pradesh, Tata Trust, JVS Foods Private Limited, and University of Toronto that we are supporting, that is looking at a large-scale trial of iron and iodine double fortified salt to fight anemia. Ambassador has already talked about soil moisture sensors and how it can prevent both water and electricity or energy loss. Similarly, on adaptation, quite interesting work is happening to support initiatives to revive and recharge lakes, springs, and streams in Sikkim. Flood-resistant toilets have been designed in Champaran district in Bihar, and so forth. So I can go on, highlighting lots and lots of these. So quite a number of innovations are happening. The challenge is to figure out which ones to go to scale and how to go to scale. Because people who design innovations are not the people who take them to scale. So we need a different sort of a partnership to be able to go to the scale. And finally, at a scientific level, at a knowledge level, I think we need convergence of disciplines and to look at all the 4 areas, to look at the nexus as it is being described. We would possibly need what is called in some parts of the world whole of the government approach, or in some places called supra-sectoral approach at a governance level, but also a robust community response. But let me stop at that, Mr. Chair, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you. In fact, the last point you made, I think, is the key for a roadmap or a vision for the future, because I think unless a holistic view gets taken at a macro level based on the micro level successes and pilots, and a reasonable kind of modeling work, which is the last project you talked about, is undertaken both at the macro level and at the micro level, we may not make the most optimal choices. And time is very, very short for all of us. So with that, I come to Mr. Claus Eklund, Senior Economist, Sustainability at SEB. He's, I think, one of the most eminent economists from Sweden, and we are glad to have you here.
Thank you, Chairman. I might be an eminent economist in Sweden, but I have to admit, as a starting point, I am not an expert on Indian agriculture. So I hope to be able in 5 minutes, 5 bullets in 5 minutes, to give sort of an educated foreigner's or outsider's view on the challenges. Okay, first, I just want to underline as an economist what you started with, the nexus, the interconnections between water, energy, and food. Without water and energy, no food, but food production can threaten actually the very livelihood, the very life that food is supposed to help. Because if food production is based on fossil fuels and if it wastes too much water, then you can't continue. We all know that. Okay. Secondly, that's the starting point now. This is especially the case if I, as a foreigner, look at India, because you are so coal dependent, and at the same time you are have a huge population growth and you have a low income per capita. And the combination here means that India, more than almost any other country in the world, must be able to, on the one hand, make energy use more efficient, and secondly, move over to renewables. And to do this simultaneously as population grows and as food production grows rapidly. This is extremely important in India also because India is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world when it comes to climate change. We all know that. According to all these ranking lists, India and Bangladesh are the 2 most vulnerable countries, to a large extent because of that lowlands, of course, and the rise of the sea level. Okay, Those are two starting points. 3, this makes it necessary to analyze this nexus, the interconnections. And that's difficult because most disciplines are in silos, as we know. You have to have convergence of disciplines to do this, and you have to do it also, the analysis must go over the entire value chain, from start to end consumer, but also the interconnections between water, energy, and food. Now, that's difficult. How to do this? Well, the economist solution is to try to calculate the long-term effects of different kinds of policies and to translate them into changes in relative prices today. That sounds abstract, but of course what it means is that burning fossil fuel should be more expensive, while renewables should be cheaper. That's not self-evident. In Sweden, for instance, now that's different than India, I realize that. The Environment Protection Agency normally asks people, what do you feel about the future? Are you worried? What can you do? And many people then say, I want to eat more ecological food, and I would be willing to pay more for that. But of course, that's exactly the wrong answer for an economist, because the opposite is true. The ecological food or the green products and services should be cheaper than the black or the dirty and the dangerous production. And that's why we need this change in relative prices with more carbon taxes and more subsidies to renewable. That can look very different in different countries, but that's the point. You have to make a national calculation on a national board. This is very different or difficult because it presupposes excuse me, statistics and knowledge about the future, technological change, and can also be politically difficult, of course. Still, it's better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong, and that's why I think it's extremely important that policymakers start in this direction. 4, if we do this, we can actually have double dividends. Mr. Chatterjee has made some examples of this. K1 Rial and I went to a seminar this morning where we had interesting examples shown, short videos from experiments and innovations on the ground. For instance, with this kind of relative price changes, it would be much more profitable in the long run to have solar powering irrigation, which means both higher production and lower emissions at the same time, a double dividend. Waste can be made into fuel, and that also is a double dividend because you can use waste, which otherwise would be wasted, and you can make it into fuel, and that helps because it also means that, for instance, you can use biogas in transportation, for cooling, etc., etc., and that means also lower losses of food. So once again, a double dividend. Now, 5th, in order to all this, you need also finance. We sometimes forget this. We talk about technology, we talk about innovations, but finance is extremely important. I guess that's why I'm here. I'm a bank economist. Of course, for small projects, microfinance is fine. For semi-small or slightly larger projects, ordinary bank credits is fine, but that presupposes better knowledge among banks and tougher regulators who also force banks to monitor and to be open about the impact of the credit portfolio, which is not the case today. Longer term, I think the answer for the big projects is, of course, green bonds, as we call them, exploiting or using the capital market. India has started that road. I think it's a very promising road, but let me end just by saying, for this to be long-term viable, it's extremely important to have second opinions of what is actually green, so that the ones who emit green bonds do not blunder into greenwashing or actually using brown bonds but calling them green. So to sum up, relative pricing, leading to innovation, technical change, and green finance, that is to me the solution or the means necessary to handle this nexus.
Thank you. And for the audience, I would add that in India, all this gets even more complicated because of the maze of subsidies and cross-subsidies that we have in this nexus, and also the enormous political difficulties in attempting to use price signals for the desirable outcomes in theory. So our life is far more complicated, but till we think about it holistically, I doubt whether we'll get very far. May I now request Dr. Keyvan Riahi, Director General, Energy Program, EASA, for his comments.
Yeah, thank you a lot, Mr. Chairman. So my background is actually I have a research background, and may add here perhaps a little bit the scientific perspective. If you think about the energy, water, land nexus, everybody has emphasized so far very much the linkages that exist between these different sectors. But in fact, there are a multitude of linkages. So if you think about water services require energy at many different places. You need energy for irrigation, basically fertilizers are pure energy. And also, if you think about food, when it arrives in the restaurants, you need to transport them, you need to deliver them. Also for that, you need energy. So there are a multitude of different linkages in one direction. At the same time, there are also linkages into the other direction. So water is required for energy. So all thermal power plants require water for cooling. There is water usage, but there is also thermal pollution of our river environments because of any thermal processes that requires cooling needs to discharge heat, at least at current technology. That's why renewables are put forward as an option and a solution. We have to recognize that also many of the renewables require water. Some of them actually require more water than the fossil alternatives currently. Hydropower requires water because of the evaporation. Biomass requires water if it's grown because of irrigation, and it on top might lead to competition with food, which basically leaves us options like solar PV and wind, which don't create either some sort of trade-offs within this nexus, and can provide energy at low emissions, not only low greenhouse gas emissions, but also low pollutant emissions, but require also low water. If you think about all these interactions, I think one thing that we have to emphasize is that we are talking about a very complex problem. So solving one solution might create, or providing a solution in one direction might create a problem in another direction. And that's why I think in this nexus area, what is needed is an integrated approach, a systems approach, which really tries to evaluate different options that we have from all these different criteria. And that poses a challenge for research because you have to align many different criteria. And it poses, of course, also a challenge for policymaking because policymaking usually tries to focus on one singular problem and tries to solve it. If problems get too complex, they are spread across too many departments, and then integrated solution becomes more difficult to adapt. And that's why I think we often don't see a lot of progress on some of these issues. So within this nexus, in my view, it is really critical to identify those options which create win-win solutions in contrast to those options that create some of the trade-offs. These synergies and the nexus itself is very important because water, energy, and food usually rank also higher in terms of policy priority compared to other long-term problems like, for example, climate change. And if you think about the Paris Agreement, which is, I think, a very important agreement, I agree that it's a breakthrough, but compared to the long-term ambitions that we have in terms of, let's say, the 2-degree targets, we know also it's not sufficient. So in order to find solutions that might help to strengthen climate policy, it is very important to think about these synergies, because the synergies can incentivize solutions which are also climate friendly. So trying to make progress on the water and energy sustainability side while at the same time solving the climate problem is, I think, something which will be increasingly important. Finding the synergies is also important if we take an historical perspective. And as in scientists thinking about future solutions, one often looks into the past and tries to identify how things have worked in the past and then extrapolate about successful solutions in the future. And the major transitions of the past, think about moving from carriages to cars and then to trains and then to cars and so on, were always connected with a certain service. Rarely these transitions were happening because of long-term environmental problems. So identifying the synergies will also be important to achieve this fundamental transformation, which is so badly needed. For policy making, this means that we have to think more about link solution. For science, this means we need to think more interdisciplinary. So, and modeling and economic analysis has been mentioned before. I think I want perhaps to mention that India is a very good position here. If you think about our host and TERI, there is lots of capacity in terms of excellent economic and also systems analysis and modeling, which is done here. And I think what we need more also to identify those solutions are meetings like the ones that we have here, where you bring scientists together with government, people from the government and other sectoral stakeholders to discuss these solutions. So with this positive note, I would like to end my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm so glad you highlighted the importance of rigorous analysis of the systems approach. I think within India we have an enormous challenge for a lot of what I would call research on a sub-regional or a geographical area basis on the details of the nexus we are talking about, because in the absence of that analysis, the scenarios and the policy options would not be that clear. So I think I'm glad you highlighted this, and I think there's a lot of good research waiting to be done in India on this. At the end, I'll request Mr. Ravi Singh, Secretary General and CEO of WWF, for his comments. Oh, you have a mic there.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. I think at the outset, I'd just like to thank TERI for hosting all of us, and I'm very honored to be here. I think TERI's put together a cracking program and very high level of discussion. I think that needs to be commended. On this present topic, I must mention I'm sitting here with giants, and a lot of the points that are important and have been said, I would just emphasize on 2 or 3 which I think are, from my viewpoint, and maybe need a little bit more significance. The first thing I'd say is that this is probably the 5th or 6th event that is being held in which I'm participating, which is talking about this particular nexus. And not just in India, not just in smaller institutional settings, but also internationally. And therefore, I think a lot of our thoughts are being converged around this particular aspect. My own personal bias is that, I'll focus on this on India, is that I think we need to work more on the water aspect as far as India is concerned. So that if there are many things in front of us, I think we need to have a bias, and that bias, and the inflection of that bias, in my view, has to be water, because we're not yet in a crisis. We can manage this, and we can manage this as not just as a resource, but also as an advantage. And it has many aspects that maybe 1 or 2 of them I'll come up with just now. Secondly, I'd just like to say that in this interdependency, water, food, energy, there has to be a component as far as biodiversity is concerned. This is something that is missed out in the conversations, and I need to bring that back onto the table again and again. And biodiversity, that indicates the health of our planet, the health of our country, the health of our ecosystem, our cities. Not just because of its representational value, health of our ecosystem, our cities. Not just because of its representational value, but also because of its natural corollary as far as ecology is concerned, and to guide also where we are in our own standing in our own evolution. So this is an important aspect. I'd just like to mention this at the very beginning. The third point I'd just like to mention is with regard to the role of the industry. And governments, societies, communities, individuals have a great role to play in this nexus. But the increasing role of industry, and there, both from a production and a consumption point of view, and the increasing role of industry and business in the contribution to the economy, the global economy, as well as the national economy in my country, is significant. And I think it's a time that we should also guide as partners to drive our industry and business towards a stewardship towards water, towards the environment, towards this whole connection in the supply chain vis-a-vis the agro-industry, as well as the energy aspect. And this can have a tremendous leveraging solution for many, many issues, not just innovations, but also better production and better environmental behavior. I'd like to focus also some thoughts on responsible consumption. And I think this is something that is not different to Indians. It's not new to Indians, but it's important because the waste as far as consumption is concerned, either by way of, quite practically in packaging or in terms of food, all this is actually wasted, water, energy, and all that. And the transportation of waste and the way it is managed needs action. I think we know enough about this. We know the problems and we know all this. The other aspect I just mentioned is that, which has not been talked about or spoken about, is that in this sector, in this scenario, India's leadership, both in our subcontinent as well as in the region, as how we evolve our legislation, how we go into action or not, what we are consuming, how we are looking at this whole energy aspect, is followed very closely by our neighbors. It affects our neighbors, but it's also very closely followed by our neighbors and those who follow a lot of our policies. And in the conversations that are emerging both in Southeast Asia as well as in Africa, a lot of the consonants and many solutions that we can learn from them and also transfer. So this aspect about the responsibility and the leadership of India, and in some of these aspects of the sector are important and must be taken further forward. I'm very happy that discussions have been talked. We mentioned millets and we talked about the dangers of the biofuels. Some of these aspects never come out sufficiently. The basis of the foundation of our civilization is one of the aspects. The grain is the millet. We did not have a channel for irrigation, and water was still scarce in large parts of India's arid regions. Millet was our main crop, and we need to discover it more and see it more practically. And I can suggest to you, because as a trekker and a mountaineer, you can have 8 rotis of the common flour that you can buy off the bazaar, and you'll have 2 rotis of the millet, and they are sufficient for you for the rest of the day. So there's something to be said in it. It's difficult. It's an acquired taste, but it's something to be said for it, and these are important aspects. The threats of biofuels as far as encroaching onto areas which will compete for food, and I think we have to be careful there. And this is something that's important, and I'm glad it's spoken about. As far as the sector of finance is concerned, is something very important in my own understanding of this. I think the leadership of certain institutions in India, not just by way of green bonds, but the sectoral leadership of organizations like NABARD, who have tried to bring this nexus closer in solutions and in providing finance for certain solutions, also for innovation, are important and need to be studied and need to be taken forward. Millions of new things are happening in India, solutions in energy, water, watershed management, communities look at certain solutions, and people are coming forward, industry is coming forward, communities are getting together, NGOs are getting together. Now, one of the dangers of this is that it should not be a runaway. I mean, some of the successes should be studied very carefully. The role of the solar pump in irrigating lands owned by, say, rich farmers, and emptying out our aquifers at a time when there is need for water for other communities and other places is something we need to be carefully study as well as to monitor. Because I have seen this happen in several parts of India. It is not at a dangerous level yet, but if taken further and if anyone does a gameplay or whatever, they should not be allowed to go forward without responsibility. And I think one last point I would say, and I'd close, two small points. One is that in waste management, mention was made with regard to waste being used for energy and power and conversion of it in power. I think the pricing of power, as far as these projects are concerned, must have a different way of pricing it, and the offset should be different. Because it combines two aspects. One is producing energy, and the other it is managing waste. So the management of waste must have a way of being priced separately. And I think this is something that we cannot solve sitting here, but certainly there's not enough being thought of in that aspect. And lastly, sir, I would just say that there is a affinity and a close understanding of the traditional Indian way of life that resides in our culture, our heritage, our behavior in many ways. And here, the way we looked at our old water management systems, the 3-year management of water for agriculture and some of the arid regions, the way our old water structures, the tanks, the bowlies, and all these were managed, the way food was stored and transported and consumed, and also as far as the way our houses are designed traditionally to look at the sun and to protect us from it and heat and all that. These are things that we need to go back to and to take them forward and perhaps look at that as an inspiration for the rest of the world. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and that was very insightful, and I particularly value your emphasis on water, because I think in our country, water challenge is real, and I see it as a challenge today and needs far more attention than it is getting, and I'm glad there is a whole session on water tomorrow. But the other thing which you said about millets, this is fascinating because I have recently been reading about these things and watching stuff on the net, and it seems that a lot of malnutrition is due to our having given up millets. And therefore, can we look at the nexus and see how we change fashions in food and tastes, and what policy instruments would drive that nationally and globally? I would like to throw the floor open for questions, but please be very brief. We'll take a few, and then I'll request panelists to respond. But do try and say what you have to say in less than 1 minute.
Sai Samit here from Talbani Solar Power Limited. So I want to know your view that what can be done on organic farming in India, because it consumes less water, less energy.
We've got your question.
Yeah.
Any others? We'll take a few together and then. Organic farming. To promote organic farming.
Sir, my question is, when we are talking about food, are we considering the meat also? Because meat industry is going to be most polluted industry in future.
Any? Yeah. Yeah, please.
Can you just pass?
Yeah.
So you mentioned about millets, and there are two specific observations. The area under millets is decreasing extensively.
Question, please.
The issue that has been posed is that earlier millets were poor man's food. Now millets are becoming rich man's diet. And there is a serious disparity which is happening in this. And that's a challenge that I want to address.
Anybody else?
Yes, I just like to know the panel's view on this option of payment of ecosystem services, whether this system, such incentives for farmers, have worked at all in other developing countries to break this nexus. And also,
Could you just please repeat? Just repeat
the payment of ecosystem services, that an incentive for farmers who actually conserve their soil and water.
Okay.
So whether other countries have done that, and what are the challenges and any successes so far. And also your opinion on, practices such as SRI, systems of rice intensification, and other such interventions.
You have a mic, so you get precedence. After that, your
Sure.
turn.
My question is regarding water. Nowadays we use RO for water purpose, that is used more than 4 times. It's a wastage of energy, wastage of water. The same is for irrigation also. So we are wasting a lot of water in comparison to Israel. They don't waste even a single drop of water. So what's going to happen?
Please.
Could you say something about interdependence of agriculture, farming and livestock, and desirability of tractors and such modern equipment which are not really necessary on the low land holdings which Indian farmers have?
And I think we'll make that the last one, I think.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah.
Now, you were talking about the water, all the panelists on the water. Vis-a-vis India's conditions, either we are having the drought or we are having the floods. And the farmer is waiting for the water and waiting for the monsoon. Even the central budget annually is presented based on the monsoon. If the monsoon is good, the budget will be good. And what you advise or suggest so that the water is evenly distributed all over the India and there is no drought for the farmers? Thank you.
So our panelists who would like to, any comment you would like to make in response to what we have said and whatever you heard from the audience?
There are so many different questions, but let me just address one of them, the issue about meat and the effects of meat production. I think that's an excellent example where you can use the kind of policy lever that I discussed, i.e. relative pricing. Meat production uses up a lot of water, and it also produces a lot of greenhouse gases. Now, with some kind of tax or emissions fee on greenhouse gases, it becomes more expensive, it becomes less profitable, and in a sense, therefore, meat production pays more of its effects on climate and on land. So I think there are some ways to actually alleviate the problems that you're discussing, i.e. from an economist's point of view. I realize that there are other angles as well.
I'll mention a couple things quickly. Is this working? Yeah,
So.
Good. Okay. Yeah, I can't respond to everything as well, but just a couple things that struck me as they went around to the questions. There was a cluster of questions about millet, about meat, about organic. One thing that struck me that I left out in my earlier comments is actually in terms of some of these drought-resistant crops, some of the more efficient kind of crops, we actually are doing some work on chickpeas, which I think has not been mentioned, but actually has potentially a great future, and I think one that is of great interest to India as well. So that may be something to add to the mix. There was also discussions over pricing and water efficiency, some of the interdependence between farming and livestock, and the notion of tractors as well. And again, the only thing I would say about that is that we are actually involved in some of the space. And it's a modest, but I think can be an important contribution. It's already been alluded to, is sometimes the pilot's not enough. You have to figure out a way to make it bigger and to go to scale. That is one big, huge challenge that we face all the time. But the fact of the matter is that in many of these areas, we are actually working along with many partners and do have some examples to show. The last thing I think I'll just get in the plug-in in terms of our own aid program is that we're partly about the United States and India, but we're partly about United States, India, and the rest of the world. And I think some of the things that are happening in India, someone mentioned some of the dynamic stuff going on, it is of interest, and we do have some projects specifically aimed at sharing some of that experience with other countries, again, with Indian partners, Indian institutions playing a key role, and that's something we want to do. I think in terms of the debate that we're talking about, partnership goes in both ways. India can learn from international experience too, but I also think that India does have something to offer at the world stage, and we try to help facilitate that.
Thank you.
Let me try the millet one. You know, there have been in the last 3 decades there have been huge focus on wheat and rice, and in that process, traditional staple like millet has been neglected, and you know, many varieties of small millets were being lost. So in the recent upsurge of interest in millet, recognizing this as a highly nutritious staple, and you know, so attempts have been made to bring back many varieties of small millet, and you know, at a farm level, at an experimental level, they are successful, but a lot more needs to be done in terms of how you scale up a millet production. Millet is included in PDS now, public distribution system now, and there is interest in the private sector in millet as a grain. There, you know, so you get ragi biscuits for diabetes nowadays. So there is huge potential for millet, but you know, there are few blocks. One of the blocks being dehulling millets. It's traditionally done by hand. It's a lot of drudgery, and with that you can't scale up production. So I have seen machineries being produced which can dehull millet, and therefore, you know, separate the husk from the white millet and can be used as a cereal. I've seen projects where, you know, millet noodles, millet biscuits, you know, are being produced, which would be applicable for urban markets in India. So, you know, millet does provide opportunities. It is part of the solution, so to say. It's drought resistant, it's nutritious, it's acceptable in large parts of India. It's a traditional diet. I mean, you know, every time I was in Karnataka, I get a ragi bal along with rice, and you know, so you can have as part of a regular meal and so on. So I think, you know, there are lots of opportunities around millet, but commercialization, scaling up, developing supply chains, removing some of the stumbling block, including, you know, farming equipments that are appropriate for our setting. You raise the issue of, you know, what type of technologies are appropriate in small holding farming in India, and that's a valid question. And millet is one where I have seen dehullers which are for smallholders. So with these words, let me pass it on to my next panelist.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it makes me hungry. Yeah, but let me perhaps respond also to a few questions. So most of the questions were related to water scarcity and water management and what options are there. I think the key options are, at the one hand, strategic storage, conveyance, and then efficiency of the irrigation. So I think when it comes to energy and water, particularly when it comes to energy, we had a too much focus on the supply side. So there's a supply side bias, and we don't recognize that 80% of the losses happen at the place where the consumer is. So appliances, and that's not only energy, that's also water. So how we use water is extremely important. And in this context, the incentives that the policy environment sets is important. So if there is a subsidy and unreliable electricity, and the pumps are running 24 hours a day because of that, because of the unpredictability of the grid itself, and electricity is there, that creates, of course, incentives that lead to sometimes over-irrigation. So I think the main options here are efficiency, conveyance, and storage.
So cattle, you talked about cattlemen. To use them for purposes of farming and householding, and so it is still part of our culture. It's not that we moved away from it. We have the highest population of cattle in the world today. Not necessarily that's efficient or whatever. And that has its own dynamics and all that. But to go back to a scenario of rural livelihood requires a certain amount of, for want of a better word, a cooling off as far as our lifestyle is concerned. It is certainly manageable, it is certainly desirable in certain cases, and will take us away from this fuel economy issue that is always in terms of pricing and tractors and all that. But it requires a different cooling off in the sense that, I mean, the same farmer is also looking at the internet on his smartphone, and he's seeing people moving forward in a different way of life. It's difficult for him to assimilate that. So it's much more than an economic issue, livelihood, it's also a cultural issue. So it's a separate and a very complex aspect for us to discuss. But certainly something that we should look at. I mean, it's a sitter. As far as, there was a mention made about production method, SRI, a system of rice intensification by using less water to produce the same amount of rice. And it's been tried out. My own organization tried this out in Gurdaspur district and also in other parts of in Orissa and in Maharashtra. And it works, and it's still carrying on. In Tripura, it's still working, and some other places. The problem with that is that while it saves us water, it's a little intensive in the way the production happens. It certainly saves us a lot of water. But when the farmer sees his neighbor doing something different and producing maybe a bit more, and having a more easy time with his production, it's difficult for him to assimilate all this. And there is no option for us to produce that kind of paddy and that kind of rice all through, and go through the same way that we are flooding our fields and all that. We will have to go into methods like SRI in the future. And there are models, and it needs to be scaled up. And similarly, similar things for cotton, similar things for, although that's not a food crop, but certainly for sugarcane and other crops, this sort of methodology can change. And there's some discussion with regard to this calendar of, that we have every year and monsoon, and therefore some people have water, some don't, etc. There are two ways to look at it. So we are children of that tide. We cannot get away from it. But through irrigation systems and through some management of water in different states, things are far better today than they were in the 60s. Certainly far better than in times of my childhood, where the drought areas were far deeper and more frequent in some parts of India. So there is progress here, but it still requires better management of the water. Not necessarily, we are not going to get water across large stretches of transportation. It's not going to be possible, and especially interstate. Speaking of which, it's the increase of the rice crop and reduction of the millet which is causing some of the issues as far as the Kaveri dispute is concerned. It's not entirely related to it, but this is one of the factors. Is meat eating part of the food nexus? Yes, it certainly is. Question comes from a nation that's large amount of vegetarianism in that. In terms of understanding a lot of this nexus, we look at the commodity markets. Commodity markets look at pricing in different ways, etc. And therefore, with globalization, we've lost a lot of the innovation that we had locally and in small economies. And as far as the commodity is concerned, meat, cattle, etc., comes under the commodity of milk. So it's just dairy, it's cheese, it's butter, it's beef, it's everything, So it's one aspect, and to understand it in that way, yes, of course, meat production is part of it. And it's not entirely sustainable and does cause harm to the planet in many ways. And I think, lastly, I would just say, sir, that a lot of these questions are interconnected. It's not that it's people asking silo-related questions. These are part of the entire thing. So I think in that sense, this dialogue does make a lot of sense and positive.
Thank you. I would end by making only 3 observations. One is that I think we've been exceptionally fortunate in the panel that we have had and the wisdom that we've got from them. The second is that they have been role models in demonstrating the proverb, the saying I picked up in school, that brevity is the soul of wit. So we've been very disciplined in terms of time. But at a broader scale, I think what the discussion has thrown up is the need for a lot of hard analysis, number crunching, modeling, and throwing up scenarios. Because only on that basis can policy options be thrown up. And within India, policy options are tougher because using the price signal rationally is a good principle to adopt, but very, very difficult to implement. And when it comes to water, energy, and food, I think the experience of the last few decades is that this is very difficult for political leaders to get the political and social consensus for the right kind of decisions on pricing. So we will need creativity on signals which are non-price related or on price related where society has a degree of consensus behind it. And that will be a big challenge. But to succeed on that front, we need again a lot more analysis, a lot more dissemination of the outcome of that analysis and research as to what is in the larger good over the longer period of time. And that, I think, is a huge task ahead of us, not only in India, but as you rightly said, what we do here is relevant for many other parts of the world because of our sheer size and diversity and differing levels of development. So I think this topic, you said you have attended a few events. I think in the coming years, I do hope that that number goes up many, many times, and it happens across a broader spectrum of society so that some consensus begins to emerge of what we need to do and how to do it. And thank you very much for being with us today.